Good day everyone. Again, this is Rachel Ramos, third year college student PSED major in English. So for today's video, I am going to explain to you the important guidelines on critiquing a poetry. So let's start. There are 7 guidelines or important guidelines on how to critique a poetry. First, we have the subject, the title, the form and structure, the rhyme, meter, layout, and line breaks. And lastly was the sound. So I am going to explain to you the 7 important guidelines on how to critique a poetry. We have the subject. Subject in critiquing a poetry is the alteration that gives you a greater chance of writing something that touches other people rather than something that is dismissed as an adolescent angst poem. So the second one is the title. One of the most important guidelines on how to critique a poetry was the title, and the first line, not all poems have a title, but if they do, it should add something to the piece. The first line is useful to reference or filing purposes, but rarely works as the title, nor should you necessarily use a direct quote from the poem. This is particularly true of short poems where the repetition of a phrase in the title and poem may detract from its effectiveness. So the third one was form and structure. So there are many formal poetry structures. We have sonnets, sestinas, dizaines, and villanelles. But sometimes one is more appropriate than other. A well-written sonnet, for example, is a lovely tool for putting forward to constructing ideas or views of one subject, and then rounding off with a conclusion in the couplet. It's not, however, the ideal form of narrating a story. Of course, you don't need to use traditional form. There's nothing wrong with free verse if it's the best form for what you're trying to say, but do make a conscious decision. The form and content should complement each other. Next is the rhyme. Rhyming couplets and iambic quatrains are difficult to use for serious, as the idea often gets subordinated to the form, resulting in doggerel. The same is true of constant end rhyme. It's tempting to twist the word order or use archaic vocabulary to force the content to fit the form. Remember that you can use half of rhyme, which is less obstructive the full rhyme, and internal rhyme too. And of course, there are only sound devices such as assonance and alteration which can be used. Next was the meter. Meter is if you find that you have to put an natural stress on an article or preposition, or you have to scurry to cram too many syllables in too short a space, go back and rework it. Don't ever be satisfied with I can make it sound right. Ask yourself honestly if someone else could. And one more thing, don't think that sleeping in an extra article, pronoun, and or but too, but make it scan. It's always the best solution to consider whether the syllable is really necessary. Layout and line breaks. Line breaks and verse structure don't automatically make something a poem. The breaks work together with punctuation to show the reader how the poem is to be read. So in poetry has been described as writing where the author has more control than the typesetter over the finished presentation. And of course, it can be fun. Fun to fit a piece about a mouse into the animal shape or to give it a long tail. Remember that poetry is a great extent a verbal art form, a verbal art form. So lastly was the sound. Mm, I've already suggested reading out loud, but it's so important that I have no hesitation in repeating myself. The sound of poetry is fundamental, and unless you read each draft out loud again and again, you cannot begin to make the best choices. By which I mean choices of vocabulary, punctuation, line breaks. They are also tightly interwoven that they can hardly be considered separately. Incidentally, reading out loud also helps with proofing reading, which is fundamental. It's extremely irritating to see and others. Otherwise, effective poem ruined by typographic errors. If the poets care so little for their own work that they aren't prepared to use a dictionary or spell checker